All right, good morning, everyone. It's January 21st, 2021. This is our regular commission meeting. Ms. Linker, would you please call the roll?
Commissioner Baker?
Here.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Oh, I'm no longer first. I just realized that. I may need to petition for a name change. But for now, I'm here, yes.
Commissioner Hatch? Commissioner Wilson?
Here.
Chair Matich?
Here. Well, good morning, everyone. I want to begin by acknowledging our newest member, Commissioner Baker. Good morning, Ms. Baker. Commissioner Baker, would you care to make any introductory remarks? I know we just swore you in.
Well, thank you. I just want to say how honored I am to get to be part of this commission, to work with fellow commissioners on the good work that the commission does with a very professional staff. I'm looking forward to the work and appreciate the opportunity to do it. That's it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you and welcome aboard, Commissioner Baker. All right. Our first item this morning is public comment for items not on the agenda. Do we have anybody on the telephone line who wishes to make public comment for items not on today's agenda?
I do.
Yep.
All right. I think we heard the first voice. Would you please state your name and your comments?
Thank you. My name is Linda Sutter, and I'm a retired correctional staff from the Department of Corrections, and serve as a civic activist with the County of Del Norte and City of Crescent City. Del Norte County has a population of about 27,000 to 29,000 people and extremely impoverished. I had very little knowledge of FPPC until about a year ago, and since then I have filed 4 complaints, 3 which are currently under investigation and 1 which was denied, and that's why I'm here today. I understand that Ms. West and Ms. Ray have been working for a number of years with FPPC and are well trained in what they do. I'm not well trained in what I do, and I'm not an attorney, but I do have legal background and some research skills, but there's never enough, as you know. I believe it's a travesty that this recent, can you hear me?
Yes,
Hello?
we can.
Okay, that this recent case was not considered. This is a great injustice for a county like ours because the supervisors never once gave a meeting of why they wanted Measure R on the ballot. They just decided in July they were going to place a sales tax increase on the ballot. The residents were not told the county was planning to utilize public resources of $40,000 for their campaign to increase sales tax. The county was not required to file campaign statements to inform the people how the mailers were paid for. Only 1 of the 3 mailers mentioned how much the sales tax increase would be. The campaign met the threshold of over $10,000 as a committee, no disclaimers. It is also worth mentioning on November, It is my understanding this organization leads the public to believe it stands for integrity and transparency, that the express purposes of the FPPC Act is to prevent corruption of the political process. With that said, in the spirit of justice, I'd like to reform my complaint and send it in again, since these ladies gave the supervisors, the Board of Supervisors, a high five. The acts of these supervisors have become more egregious. Daisy chain meetings, anonymous donations of $10,000 plus, and a complete disdain for everyone and anyone who challenges them and asks them questions. Thank you for allowing me to voice my concerns.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your comments. Do we have anyone else who wishes to make public comment on items not on today's agenda?
This is Steve Petzold in Santa Clarita, California.
Good morning, Mr. Petzold. Welcome back.
Thank you. I wanted to address you this morning because I believe that a great injustice was done to the voters in this area by the Santa Clarita Community College District, the foundation, and the community. A $230 million bond measure was passed using unfair tactics, illegal contributions, and negligent regard for basic FPPC regulations. My trust in the enforcement division to do their job is shaken. When you entered stipulation 17287, it was revealed that the Santa Clarita Community College District had made a contribution. They are a public agency, yet no action was taken against them. People's hair should have been on fire in that enforcement division when they saw that a public agency had made a $50,000 contribution to support a bond measure. I'm going to move on to 19.475, in that this is the case against the foundation, which is still on hold. To my knowledge, there is no evidence that the foundation actually made a contribution. Yet Galena West said that she was assured you that only non-donor funds were used. My research has shown that the Santa Clarita Community College District issued warrants directly to the Yes on Measure E committee. This is it really shakes me. At your meeting in August, you asked Galena West whether she could refer cases to the district attorney or the IRS. I believe the time is well past that this case be sent to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office or the State Attorney General, because it seems to exceed the capabilities and resource of the Enforcement Division to conduct a good investigation. I wanted to finish up today by discussing the fact that often you seem to use as a mitigating factor the fact that a committee may have reported a contribution which required a late filing. Let me tell you, in Los Angeles County, the records are not online. So for anybody to get the campaign finance records, they have to drive 60 miles through traffic to Norwalk, California, wait in line, go through the files, and then have to pay to get copies of the information. So if the late filing is not done, you're relying upon the schedule of the committee to do the reporting. So there's a great inability of your average citizen to get the campaign finance information, which everybody seems to think is very important to get. I ask in closing that the case 19.475 be referred out of the Enforcement Division at FPPC to legal authorities who are better able to prosecute the cases. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Petzold. The only comment I would make in response to you is that, as you know, our Enforcement Division has received additional documentation from you several times since you first spoke to us in August. In light of that, they are continuing their investigation and following up on that additional information that you submitted. And I know that they are hard at work trying to resolve these matters. So appreciate your comments, sir, and we will be reporting.
It's not that I'm delaying, it's that as information comes in, I have to do new filings. I find it necessary to do new filings as new information comes in. Thank you.
Do we have any further public comment for items not on today's agenda? Hearing and seeing none, we'll proceed to item number 2, approval of the December 2020 Commission hearing meeting minutes. Do any commissioners have any edits or comments on the December meeting minutes? Hearing none, do we have any public comment on item number 2? Hearing and seeing none, do we have a motion?
I'll move that, Mr. Chair.
Second.
Thank you. A motion and a second. Ms. Linker?
Commissioner Baker,
Abstaining, wasn't present.
Commissioner Cardenas,
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch,
Aye.
Commissioner Wilson,
Aye.
Chair Manich.
Aye.
The motion passes.
Thank you. Before we proceed to the enforcement consent calendar, I see that through our digital public comment platform that Ms. Keys wishes to make public comment. So let's pause for a minute. Ms. Keys?
Hey, Chair Matich and Commissioners, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning. I don't want to make extensive comments since, as the commissioners are aware, the matter is still under consideration with the Enforcement Division. But in light of the continued public comments that are made each meeting where our matter is not on the agenda, I did want to just reiterate that my client, which is the foundation, has been 100% cooperative in working with Enforcement Division staff. We have provided all documentation that has been requested and continue to be cooperative with the Enforcement Division. And again, I don't want to have extensive discussion on a matter that's still open with enforcement, but I did just want to make the public record clear that the foundation has done everything asked of it by the FPPC in order to resolve this matter.
Thank you, Ms. Keys. At this time, we'll go ahead and proceed to items 3 through 7. Those are enforcement consent calendar items. Do any commissioners wish to pull an item from the consent calendar for separate discussion?
Mr. Chair, if I might, item number 6.
Commissioner Cardenas will pull item number 6. All right. Let's go ahead and proceed with items 3, 4, and 5 then on the enforcement, and 3, 4, 5, and 7 on the enforcement consent calendar. Do we have any commissioner discussion on any of those items on the consent calendar? Hearing and seeing none. Do we have any public comment on items 3, 4, 5, or 7 on the enforcement consent calendar? Hearing none. Do we have a motion?
Move. Second.
Ms. Linker?
Commissioner Baker,
Aye.
Commissioner Cardenas,
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch,
Aye.
Commissioner Wilson,
Aye.
Chair Manage.
Aye.
The motion passes.
Thank you. We'll now proceed to item number 6, which was pulled for separate discussion from the enforcement consent calendar. Commissioner Cardenas?
Mr. Chair, thanks very much. Ms. Brereton, good morning.
Good morning.
Can you, I wanted to go over a little bit, Ms. Brereton, if I might, the fact pattern here. This is an individual who was at the time of the violation a sitting member of City Council of Hollister, I believe. He was also a real estate broker, and he received income through his company. His company was an independent contractor, I supposed, attached to Nino Real Estate. Nino Real Estate was involved in at least one real estate transaction, which was impacted by an action that the council member took as a member of the city council there. And my question is, when an individual receives income through a pass-through entity, whether it's a limited liability company that is set up as a pass-through, or a corporation that is set up as an S corp for tax purposes, or in this case as a sole proprietorship, the sole proprietorship is not a distinct legal entity from the individual. There's no action that the individual needs to take to establish the sole proprietorship, for example, with the Secretary of State's office, as would be the case with a partnership or a corporation or an LLC. So why do we not attribute income coming from Nino to his sole proprietorship directly to him as a natural person? Or do we? Maybe I'm misunderstanding the facts.
Thank you for your question. If making sure that I understand it correctly, you're wanting to know why the income from Nino isn't directly attributed to Mr. Clower?
Yes.
In a way, it is. That is how we're treating it here. It's just a little more winding of a road because he has his business entity set up as well. We are not, even though he has his business entity set up, where we are requiring that he disclose his source of income in Nino because it is a source of income to his business. But it's more like you have to connect those dots instead of it just being direct. But we can't control how people set up their income stream. But we do require people to disclose it in a certain way. And so on the Form 700, he's required to report that he has that business entity, however he wants to call it. But he is also required to then disclose sources of income that meet a certain threshold to that business entity. Excuse me, business entity as well.
And Ms. Brereton, in his various SEIs, statements of economic interest, 700s, before he amended them, and he amended them after he was notified that our enforcement division was looking into a possible conflict of interest and non-disclosure, right? Before he amended them, the only source of income, if I understand the facts correctly, that he identified in his pre-amended SEIs was his sole proprietorship, which was, I believe, was it Klaus Klauer or whatever his legal name is, personal?
Yeah, yes, that is correct. He disclosed his sole proprietorship, but he did not include that the sole proprietorship had a source of income from Nino.
So a member of the public who wanted to know what the true source of income for their elected official really is would need to dig beyond the pass-through entity to get to the real source, Nino, right?
Yes, it was not on the SEI. That's correct. So they would have to. They wouldn't get that information from there. In the original.
Might there be value in considering a new approach with respect to what we ask of filers and their SEIs when their immediate source of income is a pass-through entity, to further request disclosure of the sources of income to the pass-through entity, because those are the real sources of income. The pass-through entity is, now I'm going to use a euphemism, right? Which is a pejorative, but I'm going to use it in the absence of my ability to come up with another synonym. It's a shell. It's kind of like the way that LLCs are used for dark money, and we're trying to deal with that as a commission. To get back to my question, might there be any value in considering requiring of filers that they pierce their own corporate veil, if you will, and disclose the sources of income to their pass-through entity if that's what they have set up? Because it's not always the case that someone has set it up, having counsel businesses on formation issues. It's not always the case that someone sets up their entity with the most benevolent and agnostic of intents. Some entities are chosen specifically for purpose of evasion. And that's what I'm trying to get a better handle on here. So is there value, or have we considered it and for good reason decided against it?
Historically, I'm not sure whether we have considered that as a policy change. It needs to be a regulatory and statutory change. Our definitions for source of income come from the statutes, and then our regulations for the conflict of interest rules and other rules help to fine tune those. Currently, as it stands, the enforcement division has to work with the law as it is stated. But if the commission wanted to make changes in that respect, I think you could make the argument that the regulations and legislation could use an update and make those policy changes.
Well, I don't know that that I or anyone is quite there, but I do wonder if the issue is ripe for at least consideration. In the last year or two, this commission, as you know, has devoted a more focused attention on the issue of limited liability companies. I believe it's Assemblymember Berman, if I'm not mistaken. If Ms. Nakano is on the line, I believe, is it, or Commissioner Baker may well know. I believe it's Assemblymember Berman, who I believe again has the privilege of chairing the Assembly Elections Oversight Committee, if I'm not mistaken, who has reintroduced, as he did last year, but it died, as many things did, a bill dealing with LLCs, and we he just introduced it last week. Perhaps if there are other commissioners who think that this might be ripe for dialogue, perhaps this is something that we might focus on internally, and then perhaps through Ms. Nakano, our legislative expert, suggest some language that would get at this. But I don't know if the issue is ripe. I'm just wondering if there's an opportunity here, without being too invasive and oppressive with respect to filers, if there's an opportunity to shine a little bit more light on what may really be going on with respect to at least some SEIs.
So, Commissioner Cardenas, so I understand the specific concern you have. Your concern is the level of transparency with respect to income through pass-through entities. Is that correct?
Yep. Yes, Mr. Chair.
Okay. All right, Commissioner Hatch, I saw that you wish to be recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Cardenas raised an issue that, quite frankly, I hadn't thought about. In the distant past, I was a sole proprietor of an automotive repair shop, and the IRS considered that it was, me personally, it was not a separate entity or pass-through, and somehow I have not realized that we're treating sole proprietorships the same way we do a corporation or other pass-through entities. Is it clearly spelled out in the statute that they're supposed to be treated in that same way, or is it just something we've sort of always done?
Off the top of my head, I'm sorry, I don't have the statute in front of me, but the definition for source of income, as I recall, does not specify the type of business entity. It just says business entity. If you own 10% or more in a business entity, then the income sources to that business entity are also considered sources of income to the person.
Commissioner Hatch, did you have additional comment? Or I had a thought, but I don't want to cut you off if you're midstream here.
I am troubled by it because in the rest of the world, it's treated as you're one and the same. You're not separate and distinct like a LLC. And if we, in play this sort of game where they could directly receive money and call it business income and not report it as they should if it was relating to their activities as an elected official. I think that's a giant problem.
All right. Well, if I might, I want to be mindful of the fact that traditionally we do not try and make policy on a case-by-case basis and we have a specific STIP in front of us. I think you, Commissioner Cardenas and Commissioner Hatch, you've both expressed an interest in perhaps learning more about how we currently treat pass-through sources of income, and then perhaps teasing out whether that's an area that we want to focus on either from a regulatory standpoint or a legislative standpoint. Perhaps we can defer further discussion on that topic to the committee reports and discuss at that time today whether we want to have staff present at perhaps the Law and Policy Committee about how the current state of the law and what gaps, if any, they see exist, and then we can proceed from there with a policymaking inquiry. But here, really focus on just item number 6 and the merits of this STIP.
I acknowledge that this is probably not the right time or place to resolve it, but Mr. Cardenas raised it, and I think it's a valid point that we may have a giant loophole here that we need to pursue in a different process.
All right. Do other commissioners have comments on item number 6?
No, I would just, Chair Matich, just concur with the commissioners who are recommending that we further review this matter.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner Wilson. Commissioner Baker?
Likewise, knowing that we already have before us the legislative discussions regarding LLCs, maybe a loophole. It may not be a giant one. It may be more narrow, and we need to have the full information, especially if we're talking about piercing a corporate veil, which is a tradition in law for a reason. So it'll be helpful to have that more robust discussion in the context of both legislation and perhaps the Law and Policy Committee. Thank you.
Great. Ms. Brereton, do you have anything further on item number 6 before we call for a public comment on item 6?
I do not have anything further right at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any public comment on item number 6? Hearing and seeing none. Do we have a motion on item number 6?
Mr. Chair, I'll move that with thanks to Ms. Brereton.
Second.
Hey, Chair, this is Dave Bainbridge. Can we, just for the record, make it clear that when we're moving it, we're moving approval on the motion?
Yes. I understood that to be Commissioner Cardenas's intent, but for
I
the
move
record,
approval. I move approval, Mr. Chair.
thank you, Commissioner Cardenas. Ms. Linker?
Commissioner Baker?
Aye.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Wilson?
Aye.
Chair Matich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Excellent. We'll now proceed to items number 8 and 9 for Commissioner Baker's benefit and the benefit of the public. These are notices of intent to present default decisions and orders at the February meeting. We typically do this type of public notice a month ahead of time to encourage folks to contact Enforcement Division and try and resolve these matters so that they don't go to default. So no formal action is required of the commission, but this is an opportunity for commissioners to ask questions of enforcement staff to the extent that they have them on these 2 items. So do commissioners have any questions on either items number 8 or 9? Commissioner Hatch?
Just my usual question. Have you made any progress since you last put the agenda? You had contact with the people charged?
Ms. Brereton, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm sorry. Can you repeat that?
I was just asked, my usual question at this point has been that have you had any contact with the people to agenda items, or are they still ignoring you, or what's the status?
We have not had any contact from either one of our default cases
As
for
of
this
today.
month. as of today, correct.
Thank you.
All right. Is there any public comment on items 8 or 9?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. Well, my question is, this is Linda Sutter. Since you've made a default decision, how do you serve them notice?
Ms. Brereton, would you care to go through the lengthy process of providing notice?
No, you don't have to go through a lengthy process.
No, she's just going to describe the
efforts. How are they served? Are they served by mail, or does a process server actually go to the door and serve them?
Ms. Brereton.
Due process.
With the accusation that leads up to a default, the accusations are personally served on the respondents. Historically, we have served the default papers by certified mail, although we recently made a change to also require those documents to be served personally as well. So, so they are served both by mail and personal service, depending on where the case lies, timing wise.
Wow.
Since
So
that was
I
a
guess-
recent change.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
And Ms. Brereton, just for the benefit of the public, prior to the point where you're going through that process of serving folks the default papers, my understanding is enforcement staff makes numerous efforts to reach them to engage on the issue and resolve the matter. Is that correct?
That is correct. We initiate discussions to settle cases. Usually that goes on for several months to try to reach someone. If we're unable to reach them, then we move forward with the probable cause process. The probable cause report is also served by certified mail, and they have multiple opportunities to respond to that procedures, and they're served then with a finding of PC if they didn't participate. And the hearing officer finds that there's PC. So then we move to the accusation stage, and that's where we have personal service. But we often, our practice is to reach out after each phase to try to get compliance again, or cooperation, or some kind of communication with them between all of these different procedures. So we do make a lot of attempts to contact people before we get to the default. So, they have had many opportunities to participate up until that point.
Thank you. That's
Thank you
helpful
very much.
information.
Oh.
All right. Any further public comment on items 8 and 9? Hearing and seeing none, we'll go ahead and proceed to item 10. This is our beginning of our general items calendar. This is an update on the Secretary of State's Cal Access Replacement System project. And we have Assistant General Counsel, Ms. Brar, here with us this morning. Good morning, Ms. Brar.
Good morning. Hey, yes, I'm going to provide an update on the project. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of the project, IPBC's role in the project, and then finally talk a little bit about timeline for the project. So I'm going to go ahead and begin with the background. So the Secretary of State's office is in the process of developing a new campaign and lobbying electronic filing system known as the Cal Access Replacement System project. The current electronic filing system in use is called Cal Access, and it's been in use since 1999, which makes it over 20 years old. It uses very old technology. It's outdated and very difficult to use. And oftentimes, in recent years, it has crashed and been unusable for the public due to this old code that is no longer fully supported by the vendors. So because of that, the legislature passed legislation in 2016 directing the Secretary of State's office to develop a new electronic filing system that is data-driven rather than form-based. And so that is the reason why this project is in place right now. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about our role in the project. Staff has been meeting regularly with the Secretary of State's office since the legislation was passed in 2016 to provide needed input during the system development. And these meetings have become more frequent as the timing for the system to go live comes near. Staff also sits as members of the Secretary of State's Office's Stakeholders Interest Group, which includes members from the California Political Attorneys Association and the California Political Treasurers Association. This group meets regularly to receive updates and provide input on the development of the system as progress is made. Our last December, our FPBC education team completed a project to update all of the campaign forms and all of the lobbying forms to comply with requirements for the new system to be used when the system goes live to the public. Staff has consulted with SOS, with Secretary of State's office on regulations that were needed related to the new project, and these regulations are on the agenda today for pre-notice discussion. Secretary of State's office has also consulted with us on certain regulations that they've developed related to technical aspects of the system. And staff will be assisting with testing of the new system prior to when it goes live to the public, beginning in March of this year through May of this year. And staff will receive training from the Secretary of State's office on the new system once it is complete. And so moving to timeline for the system, at the last meeting, I had noted that the system was set to be certified for the public to begin using on February 28th of this year. And we've received an update from the Secretary of State's office that now that timeline has been pushed back to June 30th of this year. So now the system will not be going live for public use until June 30th of this year. And this was for several reasons, some of which include the ongoing pandemic, making it difficult to meet needed deadlines with limited staff, a special election being called with filings being due the week that the system migration was to be taking place from the old system to the new system, which would require the system to go down for 1 week. And there was also a lobbying or registration period that was occurring around the same time. And so that is the update that I wanted to provide, and I'm available for questions if any of the commissioners have questions.
Thank you, Ms. Brower. Commissioner Wilson?
Thank you, Ms. Brower, for the excellent overview and the excellent background. You answered one of my questions, indicating that the implementation date or the rollout date will be changed from February 28th to June 30th. But I also wanted to ask how feasible, or let me ask, what type of process would be in place for training of staff and state officials, given the fact that everything would have to be, for the most part, done virtually?
So the Secretary of State's office is going to be rolling out training for the regulated community. I don't know the details of that or when it will be live, but I do know that they're going to be providing trainings, and they will have training materials available on their website for people to access when needed.
Okay. And is my understanding correct that this will only apply to state officials and that it will not initially apply to local elected officials?
Correct. State officials will be filing their campaign reports electronically. Locals will not. They will register their committees on the new system, but they won't be filing their campaign reports on the system. And
then my final question, is there any projected date when local elected officials would be included in this particular program, CalAccess replacement system?
As far as I know, there is not a date for that right now.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Commissioner Baker?
Thank you for the overview. Certainly I voted for the original legislation to do this, so I'm familiar with it. But one thing comes up as you identify who's been on the advisory committee. Is there a member of the public at large? I'm wondering, for those who are not the more sophisticated professionals who are regularly accessing the system, if they have an opportunity for either public comment, whether it's going to be to us or the Secretary of State, or there's a member of that advisory body that's a member of the public. A lot of state boards and commissions have a public at large person. Trying to think of how will someone who is not a regular user, but a member of the public, this commission is also meant to be thinking of getting the opportunity for comment before the system is finalized and rolls out, if you happen to know that.
Not a member of just the general public on the stakeholder interest group, but I can take that information back to Secretary of State's office and suggest that that as a possibility to include somebody that is not already super familiar with, filing campaign reports that might be new at it.
Yeah. With no desire to delay the process. Thank you. We may, as a commission, be mindful of it as well in terms of the feedback that we try to give, because there are, not only first-time candidates, but first-time folks who are trying to find transparent reports, and they'll be much less familiar with it than the professionals.
Do other commissioners have comments for Ms. Brar? Questions? All right. I would just note that following up on Ms. Brar's articulation of the changes in the timeline, one thing that we've talked about is issuing through our website a public notice that the timeline has been pushed back. I think they have some phased dates in between then where folks will be testing the system. So I think we can assist the Secretary of State's office in making public that timeline to help stakeholders understand that. And just apropos of Commissioner Baker's comment, we have talked previously about how we're going to need, and we see that today, to take regulatory action consistent with the changes to the Cal Access replacement system. And so we've been talking about that for a couple months, soliciting feedback on that. So I think we will continue to do that, to your point of engaging the public on this, because you're right, folks need to know how to use this. So, all right. Any further comment? Commissioner Wilson.
Yeah. One other quick question. Excellent idea to post information on the FPPC website, and given that our IT staff is very thorough, I'm also assuming that there would be links from our website to the applicable links on the Secretary of State's website, so that any users, particularly new users, would be able to have easy access to all that information.
Right. That's an excellent point, Commissioner Wilson. All right. Any public comment on item 10 before we proceed to item 11?
Well, it sounds to me like you have more of a Brown Act violation than you.
Is there any public comment on item number 10?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hello?
Hello?
Oh, well, I hate to inform you this, but that lady that spoke before, I'm sure she had very valuable information to listen to, but I couldn't hear anything she said.
Thank you. We will have a meeting minutes of this meeting. I think there were times where Ms. Brar kind of came in and out. I was able to hear most of it, but we will have meeting minutes that will reflect her comments, and then also check back to our website.
Do you know when you expect to start having meetings and so the public can attend?
If you're referring to the Cal Access replacement system meetings, that is with the Office of the Secretary of State, and so we can certainly link to the information as they make that available for when they may do public outreach. Otherwise, when we have items related to that on our agenda, we certainly do make that public, and we invite public comment and engagement on those.
But what I'm asking is, when are you going to hold meetings where public can attend them?
When are our meetings going to be open to the public physically again? Is that your question?
Yes. Yes.
As soon as the public health pandemic subsides to the point where the governor's office and other state public health officials direct us that that's an appropriate thing to do.
I see. Okay. That's going to be never. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any further public comment on item number 10?
You cracked me up, Linda.
Oh, thank you.
Moving on to item number 11. This is our pre-notice discussion of regulatory amendments in response to Senate Bill 1239 and Assembly Bill 909. And we have Commission Counsel Mr. Cornwall here to present. Good morning, Mr. Cornwall.
Good morning, Chair and Commissioners. As Ms. Brar explained, Cal Access replacement system has been in the works for a while now. And in anticipation of its implementation, the California legislature passed Senate Bill 1239 and Assembly Bill 909, which take effect after the new system is certified by the Secretary of State. So as detailed in the memo, these bills update the Political Reform Act's provisions pertaining to disclosure report filing to comport with the new version of Cal Access, essentially moving the provisions further into the 21st century. Most importantly, SB 1239 amends the Act to require all state filers, state candidates, committees, and lobbyists to file their disclosures electronically. Related amendments include verification provisions related to electronic filing, removal of references to paper filing, and requiring that email addresses of filers be included in submitted reports. AB 909 amends 2 statutes for the purpose of ensuring campaign treasurers understand the responsibilities and liabilities under the Act. Staff reviewed the various statutory amendments implemented by the 2 bills and analyzed the effects they would have on the Commission's regulations. Included in the memo is a more detailed list of the recommended amendments and the reasons for implementing them. But the common goal of each recommended amendment is to bring our regulations up to date in response to the implementation of the new Cal Access and the 2 bills going into effect. This ultimately means amending the regulations to similarly remove references to paper filing where no longer applicable, requiring inclusion of email addresses in filings, and incorporating other minor amendments so that our regulations are reflective and operate in unison with the Act. As the memo indicates, most of the recommended changes are minor, with the most substantive change being to Regulation 18422.5. We recommend the repeal and adoption of this regulation to reflect that the top contributor lists will no longer be submitted to and handled by the FPPC, but incorporated into the Secretary of State's website based on Cal Access filings. Essentially, the recommended amendments seek to harmonize our regulations with the updated provisions of the Act and the new Cal Access system. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them or take any direction on changes the Commission would like to see. I believe Dave might be able to provide some more information about the timing of this now that we have received an updated timeline from SOS.
Thank you, Mr. Cornwall. Do commissioners have questions for Mr. Cornwall? Commissioner Baker?
Thank you very much. And thanks for the great summary. As I was reading the report and considering the legislation that we're working to implement here, very much in the forefront of my mind was what was referred to in the report of the volunteer treasurers who are often surprised to find themselves having violated something. And I know that one of the regulations, perhaps it's in 909, that is to try to prevent this is this certification that the treasurer or assistant treasurer acknowledge they're familiar with like they almost sign a certification that I am familiar with the rules. And with respect to that, I'm wondering if we're looking at regulations that will just say, hey, make this certification, or if there's anything more that we can do to make the certification more meaningful. Obviously, they have a responsibility to study our website, become familiar with the rules. It's certainly what I've always advised to people who are looking to be a treasurer for a campaign. But just having something that says, I acknowledge I'm familiar with the rules is a little bit like potentially we just want to cover that step. Kind of like when you just, it's almost pro forma. If there's anything more that either the regulations can spell out or we can do on our website and our education to ensure they really are going to have easy access to avoiding really what are unintentional and generally violations. And I don't know how much we can do that in the regulation based on what the statute allows beyond just implementing the acknowledgement and certification statement. But I'd really hope that there's something we can do to make it even easier for them to avoid unintentional yet easy violations. That was a long question, but I really am interested in seeing how we can we can do that. And I don't know if we can do it in the regulation language. Maybe you can address that.
Yeah, I do think that we have pretty extensive educational material available on our website, but as you mentioned, part of it is making sure that they are directed to and actually retain that information. I think that one potential solution would be either simply incorporating additional information or a link in the actual forms that we use for treasurers, or within the regulation, ensuring that something to that effect, where they will be given direction to the appropriate educational materials, would be possible to implement either, as I said, into the regulation or into our forms, depending on what the commission would like to see.
Yeah, I mean, it's reaching a balance between, look, you have to take responsibility for your own actions and that you've assumed a responsibility to be a treasurer for the campaign, and also an extra prompt and almost notice that this is not like if you're just a CPA and you're balancing your checkbook or holding accounts for someone. This is different, and this is where you need to find this information. I don't know that I'd say here's the minimum amount you should read. I think that's overly doing it and setting up trouble, but the more we can really point them in the direction of where they need to read to help avoid some of the issues that come up in Streamline, for example. So thank you. I strongly encourage that if we're able to put some language, if it's not too burdensome. And welcome, Mr. Bainbridge, if you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I just, as you're new to the commission, I wanted to give you a little bit of context on this. I think we're all on the same page here. AB 909 was legislation that we pushed for, I can't remember if it was last year or 2 years ago. They all have run together. And what you're saying was exactly the thought behind it. This came from our enforcement division, where you see lots of instances at the local level of someone who agreed to be a treasurer for a friend or someone they supported, didn't make any money and were brand new to it. So what we wanted to do was make sure, instead of just signing something that said under penalty of perjury, we really got their attention on the front end. And then when we do that, it has references to the sections of the law that are applicable to them so that they understand what their obligations are. And my understanding is, at least the last time I spoke with SOS about this, we worked with them on when the legislation was going through, from a practical standpoint, what this was going to look like. And what it's going to be is a box that pops up. So instead of just signing their name, there's going to be a box that will alert them, hopefully, one more thing saying, pay attention. This is what is going to be expected of you, and this will be the consequences if you don't perform your duties as you're required. So we were hoping to get their attention. What we will do is check our website and make sure there are ways that if it works and someone who's agreeing to be a treasurer goes, wait a second, what are my obligations, that it's easy for them to then go to our website and understand what those obligations are.
Thank you. And having really studied the website recently since my appointment, it is very comprehensive. These are adults who need to take responsibility for assuming a duty. But if we can do that, go here to the education section or at least to our website and say, you need to take this time because you're going to get hit with fines and it'll be embarrassing for you and your candidate, would be helpful. Thank you for that extra information.
Do other commissioners have questions or comments on item 11? All right. Do we have any public comment on item 11? Hearing and seeing none. Do we have a motion? Oh, I'm sorry, this is a pre-notice discussion, so there's no action today. This will come back at a future commission meeting. So thank you, Mr. Cornwall, appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Bainbridge, for your gloss on this as well. And we'll be hearing from you guys in the next couple months on this. All right, moving to item number 12. This is amendment and adoption of our regulations governing enforcement division streamline and warning letter programs and a new tier 2 streamline program. This is something that we have been discussing, this goes back to last July when we had our first pre-notice discussion of this. We've heard this several times in the Law and Policy Committee. We've engaged with stakeholders, et cetera. So this is now teed up for commission consideration and adoption. So Ms. West, did you want to give us a brief presentation?
Yes. Hello, Galena West, Executive Director. With me is Angela Brereton. She's also going to be answering your questions, so we will try to be able to volley between ourselves and answer all of your questions. So I did prepare something a little more in depth since Commissioner Baker hasn't been here for this long, arduous journey to get to today. But yes, as the chair was saying, we've presented this several times at Law and Policy, 3 times, and also at the commission meeting. We've done PowerPoint presentations to try to make it a little easier because it is pretty lengthy when you look at the regulations all together. But basically what happened was the commission, with the great leadership of Commissioner Hatch, he really spearheaded the first iteration of this, putting the streamline and warning letter program into regulations. And so when that happened back in January of 2019, the commission then said, okay, once you get data, come back and let's see what's working and what needs to be tweaked. And so that's what we did back in July, is we brought it back to the commission to say, here's what we've seen problems with, here's what we have ideas about. And then we also came up with the idea to add a second tier to the program. And it's not that the tier 2 violations are minimal, because tier 1 violations, that's what that's for. Tier 2 violations is a way to handle things that the commission doesn't really have controversial facts. It doesn't have things that need to be exposed, and because there still isn't intentional behavior. You still have the exclusions from the streamline program for anything that's intentional. And so this is just a way to deal with these violations that are not complex, not serious in the way that the commission has prioritized investigations for the staff. So this is a lot of first-time candidates and committees, or some larger committees that are making minimal violations that don't really rise to the level of a mainline stipulation. Because again, we're going by intentional behavior and the seriousness of the violations. So we wanted a way to expedite more cases so that case closure rates can go up and resolutions can be achieved sooner for where intentional behavior is not found. The commission also expressed an interest in creating a diversion program through its education and outreach division, which would allow certain types of low-level violations to be resolved through participating in an educational program. So we added language for that as well. And the changes proposed by staff are intended to further these policy preferences expressed by the commission, and the diversion program would then be fleshed out by the staff and presented to the commission at a later date, working with one of the 3 committees, or is it 4 committees? I can't keep track of that legislation committee, or is it litigation committee? They all change. So
On policy.
I think there's 4 now, but so I want to go through the highlights and try to keep it brief, but for Commissioner Baker's knowledge to get her kind of up to speed. We found 2 new violation categories that needed to be added, which was major donor filers and behested payment reports. And the major donor filers were a program that was included back in 1999 when we first started doing streamlined programs. But as I have admitted at Law and Policy, we thought we knew better. And so we thought major donor filers could fit into a typical campaign non-filer scenario. And we were incorrect. It needs to have its own category in order for it to work effectively. And so we've added it back in. And then behested payment reports were on the rise. And so we first came up with some basic criteria and then fleshed out through Law and Policy and public comment what the behested payment report program should look like. So that's what you see there. And then we found some tweaks we needed to make to the existing rules. Since the The biggest problem that we saw was from the institution of the program in January 2019 to when we put all the research together. We found the amount of streamlined cases actually went down in percentage to mainline cases, which is not what we intended with adding more criteria to the streamline program. So we looked at the different areas and tried to figure out what was falling out and was it appropriately falling out, or was this just some strict criteria? So the bottom portion of the population requirement numbers excluded a lot. And so we gave some specific examples through the last couple of meetings, but I'll give you a couple of them. These are cases that had been approved by the commission, so they're public information. A filer from Gardena who has a population of 58,000 and change had $11,000 of activity on a statement, but the population threshold was 8,200, and so had to be a mainline case. And another example was a filer from San Anselmo, population of 12,000 and change, with the activity threshold of 5,700, and the activity reported was 5,900. And so what we found is that some of these population thresholds were so tight that these smaller populations were excluding a lot of the different filers. And what we also found is more inexperienced filers, most of their activity was just on one statement. So not only was this being excluded because the activity was from that statement, but it's actually all of their activity basically. So your entire campaign is 5,700 or 5,900 because you put everything on your second pre-election because that's when you got going. So since it was by statement, it was excluding a lot of filers that would have been included under the older program for a streamline. So we also looked at the lobbying reporting thresholds because they were at 100,000. And so we wanted to put those more consistent with the campaign thresholds and make tier 2 100,000 as opposed to it being in tier 1 where there's lower penalties associated. And then the removal of the percentage thresholds. Hold on one second. Okay, removal of the percentage thresholds for campaign non-reporting. We found that we should be excluding higher percentages of both cash contributions and campaign bank account violations because of the public harm. But we found that some of the non-reporting thresholds were too low. For instance, a candidate for County Board of Education failed to timely disclose more than 20% of their total contributions or expenditures per reporting period, but amended immediately after enforcement contact before the election, but because of the 20% threshold did not qualify for warning letter or streamline. So these, we give you these examples to show you that this was all based on us doing this review of over 400 cases in order to apply the criteria over and over again and make sure that these are working, and what is not working, be able to show you exactly why. So the percentage increases in the penalty regulation was actually just causing more confusion than assistance. The increase in the percentages was to help incentivize people to file and to cooperate with enforcement, which is a noble goal. But unfortunately, what was happening is only the more sophisticated members that that were represented were taking advantage of this. And even though we did take some suggestions from the commission to put into writing earlier on in our contacts, in enforcement's contacts with respondents, that this will increase as we go on, and it still does. We're just talking about the percentage increase as the say you go through first contact and a probable cause report issued and an accusation issued. So now it's not going to go up 1, 2, 3, 4%. It would just stay at the 1%. We're not tinkering with the other percent increase, which is there's a 3% if it's about no disclosure within 7 days of the election. So there is still that still works, that's still effective and doing what it was intended to do. We clarified some of the advertisement standards because staff was finding some of them problematic in interpreting consistently. We added the second tier, as I mentioned earlier, and And I just wanted to go over, and I'm almost done, the cases that will still be excluded from both streamlined programs. So if there's an intent to violate or conceal a violation, if they presented false or altered evidence, if they made false statements, if they intentionally interfered with a witness, if there's public harm in aggregate that's just more than a minimal amount, and other violations are under review for prosecution that don't fall into streamline. So you'll see a lot of the exclusions, like if there's a conflict of interest, then you're not going to be able to be in streamline for your SCI violations. So those are the types of violations. If you're being investigated for money laundering, we're not going to give you a streamline for your campaign violations. I mean, that's kind of an obvious one. And then I'd say the final change before the last LMP was we added discretion. And I think this is an important point because the black and white criteria, while it's very comforting, it also causes some first-time filers that we even had people that complied maybe with fixing their advertisement or filing their reports after they were referred, but before we had contacted them. And so we wanted to make sure that there's some discretion that in the enforcement chief, because there's discretion the other way. So the enforcement chief has discretion to kick things out of streamline and into mainline if anything is suspicious or that too much has in combination caused her to say, no, this is mainline, there's too much public harm. So what we needed was the reverse. We needed to be able to have the enforcement chief be able to look at the totality of the circumstances and say, look, they fixed everything before the election and before we contacted them. This needs to be able to be handled by a warning letter or streamline. It's because it's appropriate with how we would treat everything else. So as you know, I'm a big defender of consistency equaling fairness. So I understand discretion makes people nervous when it comes to talking about consistency equals fairness, but I think it does actually support that because you get consistency through not having something so rigid that something that should be treated like something else can be. So there's my soapbox for the day. Then we had changes from the last Law and Policy Committee. So mostly what happened was we had comment from Trent Lang from the California Clean Money Campaign. And in response to his comments, enforcement worked on changing some language and we added some discretion for increasing the penalty. And so if you would like to open documents, if you already have the documents printed out, those would be before Law and Policy. So the ones that are on the agenda and attached, they say at the bottom, version 11621. And we have highlights in there of what the changes were from Law and Policy, but I'll just tell you generally what they are. Trent Lang's biggest concern was that top contributors, if you are missing a top contributor, as opposed to you spelled their name wrong, it wasn't clear that they were excluded from Streamline. And since that was one of the main purposes of the Disclose Act, then he brought that to our attention. Law and Policy agreed with the recommendations, and so we modified the language. And then the discretion I was talking about was adding discretion so that the chief of enforcement, if she finds that, I should read the exact language because flying by the seat of your pants is never appropriate. Hold, bear with me for a second. On page 1, lines 14 through 18, of regulation 18360.2, so that everybody has it. And it's highlighted, so we really try to bring your attention to it. The chief of enforcement has the discretion to increase the penalties for tier 2 advertising violations resulting in public confusion, and it has the citation, and tier 2 violations involving the same candidate, committee, or principal officer was paid a tier 1 penalty for the same type of violation. So basically that was to address that some advertising violations should have higher penalties, which is why 3 times the amount for missing top contributors was written into the Disclose Act. But this addresses that concern. And then also for having a prior. So if it's the same people with the prior and there's a suspicion that they have done this before and should have known better, then the chief of enforcement would have the discretion to say, okay, you can still be in tier 2, but we're gonna bump up your penalty and to make it more commensurate with what your activity was. So I would say that was one of the largest changes. And then speaking with Trent Lang last night, so he had seen the changes, and he had another suggestion, because the intent of the LMP changes were about top contributors, as I was telling you, and making sure that they're not included if you can't read them, if you can't figure out who it is. His example was you put Microsoft when it's supposed to be IBM. So the change that we are suggesting would be both in 18360.1 and 18360.3. And so I would just tell you in point 1, it would be on page 12, line 2. And what it would do is take that sentence that says a disclosure that fails to meet sizing requirements to the extent that the disclosure is not legible to the average viewer is considered a missing or incorrect disclosure. And that helps with the earlier advertisement portion. But what we would add is, and not substantially correct. And that's because the language talks about, let me get to that page. The language says, a top contributor information, the top contributor must be substantially correct. So since it must already be substantially correct, if we are then adding that it doesn't meet the requirements, if it's not substantially correct, then we're making sure that it's clear that top contributors must be substantially correct and legible in order to qualify for one of the tiers. So that is a change. And so I will put on the record in 18360.3, that would be on page 8, line 19, adding and not substantially correct. And I put quotes around substantially correct, so referring it back to that term. So I would just close by saying the Enforcement Division analyzes and processes almost 3,000 referrals and complaints per year. And the recommendations presented follow a review and analysis of the enforcement cases, both presently being considered and those previously adopted by the Commission, with the goal of creating an even more efficient and effective format to move cases more quickly. And with that, I think that covers all of the changes and gives a little bit of background.
Thank you, Ms. West. Just a point of clarification, the 2 amendments that you just referenced, the addition of the language and not substantially correct, in point 3, that language would be added on page 8, line 19. All right, and just for,
That's correct.
I didn't, which page and line for point 1?
That would be, point 1 would be on page 12, line 2.
Line 2, gotcha. All right, thank you, Ms. West. Do other commissioners have questions or comments for Ms. West? Commissioner Hatch, then Commissioner Wilson.
A couple of items. One, the issue of the additional percentage applied for people who drag the process out further and further. I'm stymied by that. I felt pretty strongly at first, but I'm beginning to settle down on that. But it's, I do find that looking at these, that if the person is represented, they tend to get it done early and the lowest fines applicable. But if they're not represented, I see that they tend to be the ones who drag this thing out. I don't know why that is, but I could be persuaded that suggest your change is appropriate. There's one other item that kind of surprised me, the change in the threshold on lobbying activity. I think you characterized it as an error. My recollection at the time was we made a clear decision on those amounts. What led you to want to cut those in half?
Thanks, Commissioner Hatch. I'm sorry if I said error. I thought I was saying it would make it more consistent with the campaign amounts. For lobbying, it seemed that the tier 1 with having lobbying capped at 100,000 was just not commiserate to the amount of activity. And so the very few cases that we did have ended up with, I think, $200 penalties. And it seemed like if the activity is over 50,000, which is what most of the thresholds are for campaign, then it would be more appropriate for the activity to be in tier 2. So it wouldn't go to mainline, but it would have a higher penalty for a larger amount of activity. That was the thinking there. And then for the additional percentage applied, you're exactly right. I mean, you see these defaults all the time, and these aren't people that are represented. But if we have these increased penalties and somebody comes to us, say one of the two that got noticed today, and they want to settle, if we have these larger percentages tacked on, then they may just roll the dice at that point, because if the penalties get too high through the process and they're an individual pro per and don't have their committee still open to raise funds, then it just gives them no incentive to settle.
Now that going back to the lobbying one, is it as you have had cases in Streamline on lobbying violations, is it the amount of the violation or the amount of the report that this threshold applies?
It's the amount report. It's the amount on the report.
So
it's for the reporting period.
So, right. If they omitted something, is it go to the amount omitted or the entire report?
The entire report, because I think the language is the total required activity to be reported for that reporting period.
And they're still quarterly reports, correct?
Yes.
I think the effect of this change is going to be to just tremendously reduce the number of people who would be able to avail themselves to the streamlined process. As you know, I was a lobbyist for nearly 40 years, and I was a single lobbying shop. In other words, I was the only lobbyist, and I was billing over $50,000 a month, and all potato. So if you contrast that to the limit, I was already well over the limit. At 50,000, I think you're talking about volunteer lobbyists, not actual lobbyists.
I think
Ms. West, can I just hop in and clarify something? Sure. I mean, to Commissioner Hatch's point, is it true that people would fall out of Streamline, or is it, as you pointed out before, they simply wouldn't be eligible for tier 1? They'd be moved into tier 2.
They'd be moved into tier 2. And I think what actually the most of the cases that we have seen are more placement agents where there's very little activity, or the report that's missing is their final report because they never filed it when they intended to stop lobbying. And really the more sophisticated ones with the large amounts of money, they aren't generally missing a report, let's say. And so if they miss amounts on the report, let's say it's a very small amount that's on the report, that's what that discretion that we're granting to the chief of enforcement is so important. Because let's say it's a lobbying report where they missed a $3,000 payment and out of their $100,000 that they reported. So then Chief Burton then has some discretion to say, well, that doesn't even rise to streamline. That should be a warning letter, and or, you know, whatever she deems it to be at that point. So, I mean, you raise a good point that sometimes the larger lobbying reports can have errors on them, but I think that we do have a safety net that protects that. We're really talking about if you missed your report generally, and your report had more than $50,000 of activity on it, then you're going to fall into tier 2 and have a little bit higher penalty than you would in tier 1.
I would like to clarify. Earlier, you said the implied amount of the entire report, not just what was not reported or reported incorrectly. And then you said that I think in the document say that we reduced the 100,000 down to 50,000, and then we apply the $100,000 threshold to the tier 2. So the tier 2 is not unlimited. It won't reach 90% of the lobbying community. And
right.
If anything, you should be doing 100 and 200. I just think this is really a mistake.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry, the cases that we have seen, most of them didn't even reach tier 2. But I think that we're mixing a little bit apples and oranges, because we're talking about missing reports and unreported activity. So remember, unreported activity, it has the same thresholds where it says total unreported activity to be reported for that reporting period is greater than 20% of all the activity for that period, or is greater than $50,000. So that threshold for unreported is different. It talks about the missing information. Whereas if we're talking about a missing statement, that's the 50,000. So I think I was confusing you earlier.
Right, but if you fail to file a quarterly report, or you file it late, this $50,000 and $100,000 threshold would apply, correct? You'd be out of streamline and tier 2 streamline.
That's correct.
Lobbyists pay somebody else to do their reports, but even those accountants make mistakes. It sounds like you don't have much data in that because most of the stuff you're talking about is not mainstream lobbyists. I just think this is imprudent to do this.
Okay.
I think it should be leave the 100 where it is and add the 200 for the threshold for tier 2. Chairman. Mr. Chairman. Okay, at the appropriate, I would like to make a motion on an amendment, but I realize that's not the time right now. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, we can't hear you. At least I can't. I don't know if everybody else can.
I can't hear him either.
Oh, you can't hear me?
And I know I've spoken to Chief of Enforcement Brereton about this, and my understanding is she is agreeable to this. I would like for her to report back to the commission every month on those instances in which she has exercised her discretion within the Streamline program, so that we can track that and have an understanding of that. Currently, the Streamline matters are in her executive staff report, which is great. But I think it would be beneficial for the commission to have that type of a dialogue with Chief of Enforcement Brereton, so we can understand the frequency and the circumstances in which she is exercising that discretion. So that's the only thing that's not in the regs, but as a matter of policy, I've asked Chief of Enforcement Brereton to do that. My understanding is she's going to be doing that going forward, which I think is a positive thing for us. So if other commissioners, sorry, Ms. West?
Yeah, did you hear Commissioner Hatch's desire to make a motion later regarding his thresholds?
Yes, I didn't hear it, but I assume that would be later.
Because we didn't hear the beginning of what you were saying. So we understand it to mean that when discretion is used under the proposal, that Chief Brereton would report it in her executive staff report. Is that right?
That is correct. Do other commissioners have, Commissioner Wilson?
Okay, thank you, Chief West and Ms. Brereton, for your excellent presentation. Now, I've had discussions with you about the process, and given that the commissioners play a role in obviously adopting the regulations and the policies, I think it would be beneficial to the public to explain that there is a process or that includes a firewall where it's clear to the public that commissioners are not involved in making decisions regarding the streamlining process, and that our only input is, with regard to the adoption of regulations and the like. So it'd be helpful, I think, for people to understand that this process of streamlining and the enforcement process is not a process that includes any kind of input at all from the members of the commission.
Maybe that's something we can put on the website on the enforcement page.
Yeah, I would defer to you in terms of, what's the best way to make sure that, the public is aware that, commissioners don't contact the Chief of Enforcement to provide advice or recommendations.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Wilson. Commissioner Baker?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the presentation. And also, I applaud the commission and the team that you have for going back and reviewing and taking a look at how things have worked out so that you can adjust. However, if that was through Commissioner Hatch's urging when he was such a central part of this conversation or this whole commission, it's very important that agencies do that. It's not like a sunset review, but it's important they look back. So I'm glad we're doing that. And I hope we'll continue to do that as the changes we're talking about are implemented. I have some real detailed questions and then some maybe bigger, broader ones. In the report and what you'd mentioned, you say that there need to be some clarification of advertising standards that staff had struggled to interpret consistently. You did mention that in your oral report to us just now. I just wonder if you could say a little bit more for this new commissioner on what was the problem with the advertising standards, and if they were the same ones you were mentioning later, or if there were other ones, just so I can better understand what was causing staff difficulty in the standards as they existed.
Unmute. Don't stop talking without unmuting. So basically the way that the language was made was first created, whereas we had a more than two standard, which was confusing because then it was like two or more than two, and that kind of went into people wondering what that meant. And then our standard in the beginning, where we're talking about resulting in confusion, then we talked about confusion about top contributor, sponsor, supporting or opposed, but we didn't actually say, and also if it's an independent expenditure. And so then we were meeting as a group of the advertising group to look at these and say, well, is this exactly what the regulation meant for the confusion that's resulting, or is this not included in this list of what could be confusing about the advertisement? So we wanted to clarify that. And then when we use the terms, the missing or incorrect disclaimers, We thought that was very clear when we wrote it. And fortunately, then it became a question of what is legible. You know, it was legible, missing or incorrect. And so those were the basic questions that kept coming up. And so instead of us making the policy and making the decision on how to apply the reg, we thought this was the appropriate venue to put in clarification as to how we think it's interpreted.
Great. Thank you. That just kind of popped out of my mind. I needed to know what those were. So I appreciate that. There's another spot, and it goes to behest payments. That is one of the categories that you're adding, where I think it's mentioned that cases were on the increase and should be eligible for the streamline. And I know that the fact that cases are on the increase I would think is not the prompt for why something should get streamlined. So, because there's a balance, there is, these are still serious violations, potentially, these are serious topics. Can you say a little bit more about why that was, other than just that cases were on the increase, that's a candidate for behest being on there? Or is it because they were just on the increase? Because if something's on the increase, it could be something else. Our education to folks about it, their own responsibility at whatever agency level they're at for learning the rules and executing them. So I wonder if you could elaborate on how cases are on the increase leads to streamline, or if there isn't a causal connection for you.
Thank you. I actually had that in the original presentation, but since it was already 3 pages long, I cut that. And so I did shorten that quite a bit. So what happened was when, back when I was still in enforcement, we started receiving behested payment referrals for late filings of behested payments. And yet we had never brought it to the commission as a topic for consideration. So we didn't have guidance from the commission as to how weighty they thought that these violations were and what criteria we should be using to determine when they're warning letters or mainline or streamline steps. Obviously, they didn't even qualify for streamline at that point, but mainline or warning letters. And so that was really the impetus of bringing it into the streamline program, was to get a consensus from the commission as to what factors we should be looking for when it comes to behested payment. And the commission had several discussions about behested payment reporting. And so we had an inkling of where they wanted to go, but we wanted the commission to make the decision. These are the criteria. This is what qualifies for streamline.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Because the fact, if you're seeing a pop-up in numbers of some of these violations, that could be both on our end in terms of what more we can do to educate, as well as, folks' own responsibility. You're hearing a theme from me probably already at this point. I want to also second the chair's recommendation that we do get a report on discretion, because it is important that we give you that you have discretion to match the penalties to these particular circumstances. Getting in the weeds on them will have you as close as a fact finder as possible to do that. But I think we have a responsibility to know a little bit more when that discretion is being used to help look for consistency. So I will look forward to that report as well, and appreciate the chair's mention of it. And finally, the diversion program. Is that going to be a discussion we have later, or are you going to address that later? I know we mostly focus not on the diversion program here, but are you going to say any more about that? We've mostly talked about the other potential regulations.
No, we can't put you to sleep at your first meeting, but no, the diversion program, this is the authority to, and the direction from the commission saying this is priority. We want to see this happen. And we want to make sure that it's in writing somewhere saying this is a program that's going to happen in the immediate future. So in my presentation, I noted that we would be bringing it back probably through one of the committees and starting to flesh it out. And then we need to have some internal meetings with all of the divisions, because this would affect everybody basically, and start seeing how we can roll this out. What's the best way to do it? What's the best software? And so who knows, maybe Commissioner Wilson and technology and outreach would take up this project.
Good. I was mindful. It's almost like when someone, I of course wouldn't know anything about this, but you get a speeding ticket and you go to traffic school to avoid a point on your insurance. And, you know, there's a ability to do that, but it's meaningful. It's interactive. It's not pro forma where you could basically check out and you're essentially having your wrist slapped for what could be repeated violations. So since we'll be addressing that further, I guess my encouragement is that it is meaningful and you know, not too onerous, but that people really do have to stay awake and engage and learn from the diversion program so that it's not just pro forma and meaningless. Thank you for the updates.
Great. Do we have any further commissioner questions or comments for Ms. West? Hearing and seeing none. Do we have any public comment on this item? And again, for the public's benefit, we are on item number 12. This is our streamline regulations.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Hi, this is Trent Lang, President of the California Clean Money Campaign. Good morning, Chair Madish and commissioners, especially new Commissioner Baker. I'd like to applaud the commission and staff for its efforts to further improve and expand on the streamlining regulations. As Ms. West pointed out, as sponsors of the California Disclose Act, we raised several issues over the earlier draft language, especially in regards to our concerns to ensure that advertisements and reports impacting top contributors on ads were excluded from streamlining. I'd like to thank the Law and Policy Committee and staff for addressing those most important parts of those concerns in the latest draft. As Ms. West pointed out, our one remaining technical concern on the new language is that it could be read as not excluding ads that have top contributors that are not legible. So we're very pleased with our suggested addition of adding and not substantially incorrect to those sections in both regulations 18360.1 and .3. That seems like it should clarify the issue, and if the commission makes that addition, we'd be very happy to support the new regulations. And thank you all again for all your work on it, starting with Commissioner Hatch's early leadership, going all the way through the great work Law and Policy and staff have done on this latest version. Thanks again.
Thank you, Mr. Lang. Do we have any additional public comment on item number 12? Hearing and seeing none. Do we have a motion? Commissioner Hatch.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, to propose an amendment to the existing proposal to restore the Tier 1 threshold for applied to lobbying reports to its $100,000 and also to change the Tier 2 to $200,000. And if I may speak on that, I'm concerned that if you were to just look at all the reports and find out how large they are, you'd find that probably under 5% of the reports would meet this $50,000 and $100,000 proposed thresholds. And I just think that it's just buying trouble, and it puts pressure on the enforcement staff to then try and use discretion to override something that they shouldn't have done in the first place, in terms of we shouldn't have done in the first place. And I just think it's inappropriate, and I would urge you all to consider this amendment.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner Hatch. Do any commissioners wish to second the motion made by Commissioner Hatch?
Well, I'll give him a courtesy second. Doesn't mean I support the motion, but I would like to hear further from, the Chief of Enforcement and the and Chief Executive Director West before we actually take any action one way or the other.
Thank you.
Ms. West, Ms. Brereton, do you have, I know you responded to Commissioner Hatch previously, do you have anything additional you wanted to add?
I don't see Angela jumping in, so I'm gonna take it. There really, I mean, Commissioner Hatch is correct about one thing. There really aren't that many lobbying cases. because lobbying audits are not being conducted right now. So we don't have a large universe other than what comes in through complaints, and sometimes the Secretary of State's referral for non-filers. But the ones that we have, the majority of them have fallen under the Streamline program as it exists now. And there's been hardly any. I can maybe think of one mainline lobbying case in the past year. I don't know if Angela's memory is more accurate than mine, but so that's with the $100,000 threshold. And I think that before placement agents were added, then Commissioner Hatch is correct about the 95%, but now that placement agents are included in the definition and have to file lobbying reports, then I think that kind of skews it all down to a lower group, and we should have a lower tier to capture their activity. That's my pitch.
Thank you, Ms. West. Thank you, Ms. West. Ms. Brereton, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yes, I would stress that because we have so few examples right now to show that a higher threshold is needed, but we do have some examples that show that a lower threshold would work well. That I think it would be helpful to give it a try at the lower thresholds, and then when we come back in a year, 18 months to give a report about how everything is going, then we can make the adjustment based on better data from another year, 18 months worth of cases that have come through.
Thank you, Ms. Brereton. I will just say, I think that's this is the first opportunity we've had to look back from sort of a data-driven perspective, which I think is important for our agency to make decisions based on data. And in this case, we have our staff coming to us based on the data they've seen, recommending that we try lower thresholds. We always have the ability to go back and adjust those as we perfect this and kind of find the sweet spot for the various thresholds. So I just wanted to make that point. Commissioner Hatch, I see you want to be recognized again.
Thank you. Well, what in essence we got through all the detail is that the staff is saying that we don't have enough data to know whether this is appropriate to change or not, but we're going to recommend changing it anyway. And if we can always change it back if we find enough data to do otherwise. I say on the side of prudence, you leave the 100,000 threshold alone and wait till you do have data, and then make a decision as to whether or not it's appropriate to reduce that threshold.
Yeah, I think I heard something different from staff, Commissioner Hatch, but be that as it may.
Did
other commissioners wish to speak on this? Commissioner Cardenas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A question, Ms. West, you made a reference to there being no audits currently of lobbyist reports. Can you expand on that just a bit? Why would that not be, and how is that controlled?
So the Franchise Tax Board is in charge of the lobbying audit program right now, and unfortunately, they haven't had the resources to complete lobbying audits the last couple of cycles, and so they've been asking for more resources in order to complete that. But those lobbying audits, once they're concluded, then come over to the FPPC for prosecution, and it's a large source of where you actually find anything that's not reported, as opposed to the SOS referrals, which are for non-filing.
How recent is the inclusion of placement agents in disclosure?
Good question. Timeline is not my strength. Everything blurs together. It's been at least a couple of years now. I would say 2018. But I don't know if Dave Bainbridge remembers, since he seems to have been scarred by their addition back when he was in enforcement. But
I believe it's more like 2011 when they were added to the definition of lobbyist.
Really? See, never ask me a timing question.
Yeah, well, yeah, at least you were close, Ms. West, right?
Yeah, my kid's birthday just happened and I got that age wrong, but
Well, you remember their names, and that I suppose is what really matters.
right.
Well, let me ask: the inclusion of placement agents was that occasioned by certain various alleged, if not actual, CalPERS acts of malfeasance?
Correct. So the resolution was to add placement agents under lobbyists. I'm not convinced that that was the best way to go about taking care of the problem. But what it does leave us with is a lot of out-of-state actors that participate maybe in one transaction and with low level of activity, hardly any payments, and then never participating in California again. So we have a lot of those types of cases where they didn't file to stop being a lobbyist, and therefore their filing requirements still continued for the whole 2-year cycle.
When was the last time lobbyist reports were being audited? Am I the only one who seems to be concerned about the absence of audits on lobbyists? Should that not be done by somebody?
Commissioner Cardenas, you are correct. That is an area of concern for all of us. And I would just remind you that we do have legislation that we are currently working on that would allow us, the FPPC, to have the authority to do those audits of lobbyists because of the fact that they're not being done. And we had FTB do a presentation, I think it was sometime either last year or maybe even the year prior, about the challenges that they're facing. So this is something that certainly has been on our radar, and we're trying to do what we can about it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I assume that the lobbyist bar is lining up to support legislation to give us that power.
That's my understanding.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Commissioner Hatch was going to make some phone calls for us, right?
Yeah.
Commissioner Hatch.
I think I remember a few.
Well, yeah, there's ex parte rules, so just let us know.
Yeah.
I may have more questions, but I believe Commissioner Baker may have a question.
Yeah, my response was tongue in cheek.
My hand raising was to join you that it is, I don't want to be in hyperbole, but it is alarming that there are no audits happening at all for all the obvious reasons. And it's affecting one of our sole and central missions and the ability of our team to have appropriate data. So whether the solution is for us to have legislation that gives us the responsibility, I think there'll be a conversation about that later, or to, in other ways, weigh in on it so that the FTB either has or executes on the resources they have. This was alarming to hear that they haven't happened at all. I do want to go back to the question that Commissioner Cardenas did start with, and that was how long have audits not been happening? And is that an overlap with your lack of data? How long are we talking about here, to your knowledge?
Yeah, I don't know what is publicly known as to how long they haven't been being done. Chair Matich may know the public information, but I know it's at least 2 cycles, which would be 4 years. And yeah, yes, it's a direct correlation to the lack of referrals. But I'm assuming it's more than that. Longer, I mean.
I don't have a specific recollection of the timeline, but when we learned that, at least when I learned that when I first became chair a while back, that is one of the things that we immediately started trying to address.
Thank you. And just to the underlying motion, I'm very grateful for Commissioner Hatch's background and expertise on this, and I think he's definitely trying to address a concern. I tend to fall on the side or point that Ms. Brereton and Chief West have mentioned, and with the hope that we will get better data and we don't have to wait that long to reassess the regulation. And I appreciate that the issue's been raised, but I'm leaning on that side. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner Baker. Commissioner Wilson.
Yes, Chief West and Chief Enforcement Brereton, it would be helpful with the chair's okay if in the next meeting or the next couple of meetings, we could get a report on, the background behind the audits of lobbyists, and I think that will give us additional information to be able to make decisions moving forward. And I think it would be timely given the fact that we're also pursuing legislation on that same arena or in that same point as well.
Yes, we can provide all that information to Ms. Nakano because it is part of our legislative package. And when she makes the presentation on the bills, I think she's doing that in February, then she will have all that information.
All right, thank you.
All right, do commissioners have further questions or comments on the motion that Commissioner Hatch has made to amend the proposal with respect to the lobbying limits? Hearing and seeing none. Do we have any public comment on the motion by Commissioner Hatch? Hearing and seeing none. We have a motion, we have a second. Ms. Linker?
Commissioner Baker,
No.
Commissioner Cardenas,
No.
Commissioner Hatch,
Aye.
Commissioner Wilson,
No.
Chair Matich.
No.
The motion fails.
All right, that motion having failed, do we have a motion on the proposal that is before us with the caveat that we have a request from from Executive Director West and from Chief of Enforcement Brereton to make amendments in Regulation Point 1 on page 12, line 2, and Regulation Point 3 on page 8, line 19, to add the words "and not substantially correct." Do we have a motion to approve the regulations before us in item 12 as amended, proposed to be amended by Chief of Enforcement Brereton and Executive Director West?
I'll move that, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Aye.
I will
Second.
second, Commissioner.
I'm moving on to other things. Sorry about that.
Commissioner Baker seconded, I think. So
Commissioner Baker seconded. All right, motion by Commissioner Cardenas, second by Commissioner Baker. Ms. Linker?
Commissioner Baker,
Aye.
Commissioner Cardenas,
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch,
Aye.
Commissioner Wilson,
aye.
Chair Matich.
Aye.
The motion passes.
Thank you. How are
Thank
folks
you.
doing? Do we want to take a brief 5-minute break before we get back at it, or do commissioners wish to continue through?
A break sounds like a great idea, Mr. Chair.
All right. Why don't we go ahead and take about a 5-minute break, and we will re-adjourn at noon. All right, welcome back, everyone. We'll go back on the record here. We are on item number 13. This is an update on our Digital Transparency Task Force. For the benefit of the public and Commissioner Baker, the Digital Transparency Task Force, something that we put together back in 2019 to study transparency with respect to campaign activity that's occurring on social media and other digital platforms. We have some pretty good laws here in California that address those areas, but as that technology continues to evolve, we continue to evaluate that to make sure that we're embracing best practices and doing all that we can to bring transparency to that type of activity. So we had started meeting with our panel of experts who comprise that task force. Unfortunately, COVID put us off our initial timeline, like it did with so many other things. So we were able to start back up late last year. And so in December, we had our most recent task force meeting. And at that meeting, we talked about an updated timeline to complete our work. We heard a presentation from the now former California Secretary of State's Chief of Staff, Mr. Schwab, on Senate Bill 1104 from 2014. That was then Senator Padilla's effort to create and authorize the creation of a digital ad archive in California. So we heard a little bit about the parameters of that and what the thought was at that time. We had a presentation from the City of New York, who does have an ad archive. Previously, last year, we had a presentation from the City of Los Angeles, which also has a digital ad archive, just trying to get information from those folks about the parameters of their systems, how easy it was to build out, the information they collect, et cetera. In December, we had a presentation from Unearth Campaigns. These are campaign professionals talking about emerging trends from their perspective that they saw in digital media. Among other things, is very interesting. We talked about using Instagram influencers to influence campaigns and some of the challenges with respect to that from a regulatory standpoint. We will continue to actually take a look at that. And then we had some follow-up legal questions that task force members were briefed on from prior meetings. Our next meeting is tomorrow. So again, we'll be meeting tomorrow for the Digital Transparency Task Force. We're very excited. We're having a presentation from Facebook about their digital ad archive and the parameters of that, how that worked out during the last election cycle. We are continuing our discussion about emerging issues from the 2020 election cycle with respect to digital media. I know Mr. Lang and his group from the Clean Money Campaign are going to be presenting, as well as our staff, from our perspective, from enforcement, from legal, what are some of the areas of emerging technology that we could continue to focus on. And so as we have those meetings, we continue to update the full commission on the work that we're doing. And those meetings, much like our meeting today, are broadcast live on YouTube. We have transcripts. They are public meetings open for everybody to watch and call in to participate in. So that is our update on the Digital Transparency Task Force. Did commissioners have any particular questions on that? Hearing and seeing none, we'll go ahead and move to item 14. This is an update on our committee updates. So as Ms. West alluded to, I believe we are up to 4 committees. One committee met last month, and that was our Law and Policy Committee. So that's Commissioner Cardenas and I. Each committee is comprised of myself as chair and one commissioner. So we met in Law and Policy and heard comments on the streamlined regulations, additional feedback on those, which we've discussed previously today, and also received an update from our legislative council on our legislative bills. With respect to this month in Law and Policy, we anticipate, again, hearing an update from our legislative council just to get a sense of how legislation is going. So that is what we heard last month and what is on the agenda in February as well. So any questions from commissioners on the committee updates? I guess the one final thing I would mention is, in addition to a Law and Policy meeting in February, we're also going to have a budget and staffing meeting in February, consistent with our governance principles to receive and review a draft budget for the 2021-22 fiscal year. Moving to item 15 then, this is our legislative update, and we will welcome Ms. Nakano. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And good afternoon, commissioners, and welcome, Commissioner Baker. I'm Lindsay Nakano, Legislative Counsel for the Commission. In addition to the information in the general update in the legislation report, staff has almost finished submitting draft requests to the Office of Legislative Counsel based on the proposals approved by the Commission this past fall in September and November. Tomorrow, the 22nd, is Ledge Council's deadline to submit requests in order to get them back before the bill introduction deadline, which is February 19th. Next month, as Executive Director West previously mentioned, I will be providing a more detailed update on the development of those proposals. Also, in today's legislation report are relevant committee appointments and the commission-related bills that have been introduced so far. Two of the bills are new since last month's commission meeting. AB 227, introduced by Assemblywoman Davies, prohibits a governor's appointee from making a monetary contribution to the governor's campaign or a committee organized to benefit the governor's campaign. It also prohibits those contributions for 1 year after an appointment has ended. If a prospective appointee has made a contribution, the appointment would be prohibited unless the governor or the committee refunds the contribution. These contribution prohibitions would also apply to a member of the appointee's household. I also presented on this bill at the Law and Policy Committee meeting last week. And Mr. Chair, you had a few questions for the author's office. I was able to get in touch with them and get those answered. The first question was about what the underlying policy objective of this bill is. According to the staffer on the bill, the policy objective is to make sure that appointments by the governor are based on experience and/or merit, as opposed to political favors from donations. They pointed out that both Governors Brown and Schwarzenegger had elevated certain political donors to various commissions and boards. The second question was why this applies only to the governor and not to other executive officials with appointment powers. The author's office responded that Assemblywoman Davies believes that leadership must start at the top, and the top official of the state is the governor. They added that the governor has the most power to appoint in the state, and that the scope of the governor's appointment powers is vast, as it includes positions like members of boards of supervisors and the Public Utilities Commission. The third question was about whether there may be any First Amendment issues with the bill since it restricts campaign contributions. The author's office stated that there doesn't seem to be a violation and that they had talked to Legislative Counsel on the issue. Commission staff is also doing its own analysis on the question, and I will be able to report back next month on what we find with regard to that question. Moving on to the second new bill since last month is AB 236. It was introduced by Assemblymember Berman. The bill would require a committee to include within its campaign statement the name of each individual who owns or controls the contributions or expenditures of a limited liability company or foreign limited liability company from which the committee received a campaign contribution. The bill would also add LLCs to the definition of multi-purpose organization for purposes of the Act, which would, among other things, subject them to certain registration and campaign reporting requirements, including the disclosure of information relating to the organization's donors. Staff has been in contact with staff on the bill, and they are receptive to feedback and are very interested in working with the commission and staff on finding the most effective approach to imposing these additional disclosure requirements. So staff is currently in the process of analyzing the best way to accomplish these goals, and I should have an update on that next month as well. And I have no additional updates on the remaining bills, so I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Nakano. One thing I would just raise, in case you weren't watching the meeting earlier, we had a discussion about lobbying audits, and as you know, that is one of our legislative bills is to ask the legislature to provide us authority with respect to auditing lobbyists. And so I think it would be beneficial next month if you have on your radar providing us some background on FTB and the challenges they have been facing with respect to auditing lobbyists, and to help us understand really the critical need for this legislative effort that we're pursuing this year.
Absolutely. I'll have that update next month.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Nakano. Do other commissioners have questions, comments for Ms. Nakano? Commissioner Wilson.
Thank you, Ms. Nakano, for your your update. But my question relates more. Turn my mic off. It relates more to the scenario regarding Member Davies' bill that would apply to members of the household of an appointee. So you could have a situation where, let's say, your mother-in-law is living with you or father-in-law is living with you, and they want to make a campaign contribution. I'm assuming that someone is looking into the legality and applicability of that provision, because what if the person in your household who's an adult says, I have a First Amendment right to make any contribution I want to, and the fact that you're a gubernatorial appointee does not apply to me. So it's more of a rhetorical question that hopefully will be answered in the course of the process.
Thank you for the comment. That's certainly something that we will be looking into as we analyze the implications of the bill and the First Amendment issues.
Thank you.
Commissioner Baker?
Thank you. Thank you for the update. Legislative calendars always make it fun to get drafts in time and with the deadlines. I had just one additional point on the bill by Ms. Davies, Assemblymember Davies, AB 227, that if in your analysis that Commissioner Wilson has pointed out the need for in terms of other members of your household, if you can also look at where there are parallels in existing law in other regulatory measures, for example, just what has to be disclosed and when people have conflicts of interest, knowing how else other members of your household are treated as we look at this bill going forward, when you provide your report in February, might be helpful. So we see where we're comparing apples and apples potentially. And with respect to the, this is more of a comment about legislation that we might get involved in and either sponsor or submit testimony on. And that is, some of the bills that are reported here, there's more than one party that appears to have introduced very similar bills. I'm looking at the slate mailer legislation that is in your report. Given the nature of this commission and what we do, I hope when you have your report in February, and as we weigh in on legislation as a commission, we look at the opportunity for encouraging bipartisan authors, so that if at all possible, the legislation that we become a part of, whether it's by endorsing it or sponsoring it ourselves, if it is possible, and it isn't always possible, and if it is, it doesn't hamper the ability of our bill to get over the finish line and on to the governor's desk and sign, that we may look for opportunities to encourage and support having bipartisan authors of bills. That will be something that I will probably pepper you with questions about in February, and for any bill that we are taking the lead on or weighing in on. And I wanted to give a heads up on that more than ask a question and encourage it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Baker. Commissioner Hatch?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question, Lindsay, you had pointed out that the deadline to put bills over is upon us. Are there any proposals that you've yet not placed with an author?
We're still approaching authors, so I don't have too many updates on that yet. The deadline is just for the purposes of getting that language into the correct form and the correct legislative council form. So we still have time for authors. It's just the deadline for Leg Council.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misheard, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hatch. Any further questions or comments for Ms. Nakano? Commissioner Cardenas?
Mr. Chair, thank you very much. Ms. Nakano, Assembly Bill 236 by Assemblymember Berman, the chair of the Assembly Elections Committee, as I understand it. And Ms. Nakano and I, Mr. Chair, as you know, exchanged some emails earlier this week with respect to this particular bill, and language and the scope and intent. Ms. Nakano, do you think there's an opportunity if it helps the bill to not rely on the pre-existing multi-purpose organization vehicle that exists statutorily right now, and just do the work to describe limited liability companies as such, and how contribution limitations and disclosure should be applied to them. As I read 236 in its initial instantiation, the reliance on multi-purpose organizations, perhaps because the definition of that term itself I find to be clunky and inartful. I'm just wondering, with all due respect, right? I'm just wondering if is this, do you think, just intended to be placeholder language until someone comes up with a good idea of just describing what it is that they want to do?
According to the staff on the bill, this is kind of a starting point. They're open to looking at different ways to do this and hearing our feedback. So I don't think that this is by any means anything, they're not wedded to this specific language or this specific strategy. And staff is looking at other ways to do this that might be more straightforward or could avoid any unintended complications. So staff is definitely looking at that and on the same page in terms of looking at strategies that might be able to do this in a more straightforward way.
Ms. Nakano, as you probably recall, I've referenced the state of New York LLC law, which is now only I think in a couple of weeks it'll be only 2 years old, but perhaps the way that limited liability company is defined over there, which isn't too different from the California Limited Liability Company Act type of verbiage. Now, the New York statute is much more sweeping than the proposed AB 236, as you may know. The New York statute, which I have suggested some fascination with, but I have not suggested yet to my colleagues that we should move in that direction. It's got an absolute cap, as you may know, of $5,000 from any LLC, and yet it got through the legislature, and that is the law. That is the law in New York. But my long-winded point is referencing at least the language, if not the objectives and the teeth of the New York legislation, might be helpful.
Thank you.
I might have some other comments, but I'll defer to my colleagues.
Thank you, Commissioner Cardenas. I mean, I think just as a reminder, the commission has expressed, I think, pretty clear direction in terms of what we want conceptually with respect to LLCs. I mean, really, we want to know who the people are that are making the decisions behind the LLC, and we want to get at the source of the money. And I think the New York model is a robust model for accomplishing those goals and worthy of our consideration. There are other models, including the one proposed by Assemblymember Berman. So I think my understanding, staff has a very clear understanding of what we're trying to accomplish, and they will in February be presenting us with their best thoughts on how in California we can best accomplish those goals. So I do look forward to that next month from Ms. Nakano. Did other commissioners have questions or comments from Ms. Nakano? Commissioner Hatch?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Nakano, I just wanted to thank you for putting in your update the new committees memberships. I find that very helpful. And I don't recall that happening in the past, but if it did, I stand corrected. But thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Commissioner Hatch. Commissioner Cardenas, I know you said you had other comments. Did you want to speak to those at this point?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thanks very much. As it continues to appear in the Cal Legislative Information, the verbiage of 236 still cites it as being quote, the LLC dark money ban, end quote. And in news reports, since this was introduced last week, it has been referred to as Assemblymember Berman's LLC dark money ban. The bill, as it exists, does not, as I read it, ban LLC contributions. Do you believe, Ms. Nakano, speaking with the member staff, that the intent was or is to actually articulate and have the legislature enact some sort of ban? Because if that is the case, then the New York statute may have more relevance than even I believe. Does he want to ban? His bill doesn't do it right now, but if he wants to do it, some of us might be willing to help.
It's a good question. I don't know the intention of the author beyond the language and the brief conversations that we've had so far, but we'll be working with them to see where their intentions, the scope of their intentions, and how we can do that in an effective way.
Mr. Chair, did you suggest that in February we are scheduled to have, or are you just suggesting to Ms. Nakano it be a part of her presentation in February, that we are going to revisit some robust LLC oriented discussion?
What we have asked staff to do, consistent with prior legislative efforts, is they received late last year the direction on concepts for us. They are now working on the language that they believe will accomplish the policy objectives we articulated last year will be presented to us in February. And that would be the opportunity for commissioners to provide some feedback and comment to staff and essentially find out, what did you look at? You've referenced the New York model a couple times for LLCs. I mean, I will just tell you, I know staff is looking closely at that model among other models. So we'll be receiving that information and update from staff in February, which includes the LLC matter.
Mr. Chair, in connection with consent item number 6, we had a brief but I thought interesting conversation, or at least the beginning of a conversation with respect to whether there might be merit in investigating requiring more of filers whose source of income is I'll use the term a pass-through entity, whether it's an LLC, a sole proprietorship, or a corporation is established with the IRS's consent as an S corp, and so it occurs to me that the LLC legislation specific presentation next month wouldn't be a vehicle, but I'm really asking for your direction as much as anything else, Mr. Chair, in order to provide to first deliberate among ourselves whether or not we think that there's an opportunity to enhance transparency there. Is that something that perhaps I should bring up at the end when we have the opportunities to suggest future agenda items? Well,
yes, you sort of read my mind on that one, Commissioner Cardenas. I was going to, if you didn't or nobody else did, for item 18, I was going to suggest that the full commission get a briefing from staff on the pass-through income issue, with the first step being, let us understand what the law currently requires, both statutorily and through our regulations, with respect to pass-through income, a perspective from enforcement and legal on what gaps, if any, exist with respect to that issue, and then the commission can deliberate and provide further direction. But my contemplation was we would be discussing that with respect to item number 18 on today's agenda, because that is a future agenda item.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Ms. Nakano, thank you.
All right. Any additional questions? Commissioner Baker.
I try not to come back around after I've already done it, but since we're giving a little bit of guidance to Ms. Nakano, I think it is actually Commissioner Cardenas. It might be AB 20 that is in the report that seeks to address whether LLCs or quote business entities can make contributions at all. Maybe Ms. Nakano knows better than I, but that's the one that members Lee and Calra might be floating. So there may already be a vehicle out there. Not saying that I think that is one that we would necessarily want to support, but since you mentioned that, that's AB 20, that may be what you're talking about. I would be interested when we have the conversation, and hopefully it will be a very robust overview of the treatment of LLCs, not only the pass through, but the who's covered already and the thresholds and so on. But when we have this discussion next month about 236, and as you speak with the author's office, be very interesting to this commissioner how like really small LLCs are going to potentially comply with this without a very large pitfall that could just be difficult for them, and see a lot of LLCs end up in the streamline process that we're just hoping to exercise their First Amendment right and move on with their business life. So that is one area, the small, how we're going to look at the scale. I mean, perhaps some people are thinking of really big ones. Often when they think of LLCs, they're thinking there's a big corporation out there or shells, but this could also potentially be a web that is very, very broad. So I would be curious in your conversations with the staff, that is going to be a concern of mine and one that we may want to understand thoroughly. And the second is, I see from the summary language, and I will confess I have not read the bill yet. The summary language says that LLCs, the individual who owns or controls, and there are thresholds in the law. We heard one mentioned earlier today, 10% ownership, or some people own very little of an LLC, whether it's 3 people who are part of the LLC or many more. And how are they going? Is the intent of this bill to really capture any level of ownership? Because I think there's a sensitivity there as well. That's just to give you some guidance and conversations. I know those will be questions I'll be asking in February, so might as well put them out there to you now as a heads up. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Baker. Any additional comments from commissioners for Ms. Nakano? All right, well, piggybacking on Commissioner Baker's last comment, you know, the benefit we have is last year when we first started really digging into LLCs, when we found out that the legislature was not going to be able to take up that bill last year that we proposed for both the source of money and the folks behind the LLCs, we took action consistent with our regulatory authority to require the disclosure of the folks who are behind the LLCs that are contributing in state and local elections. And so I think it would be very helpful for our staff to be able to report back on how that regulation worked out and how LLCs were in terms of compliant. We don't need to speculate at this point, thankfully, because we did take that action last year. We have some data that we can point to understand what the effect on LLCs is going to be. So I just commend that to Ms. Nakano to get with legal and enforcement on that, and let's get the data. All right, thank you, Ms. Nakano, appreciate it. All right, moving on to item number 16. Oh, well, you know, you don't get to leave, Ms. Nakano, do you? You're on that one too. So Ms. Nakano and Ms. Vasca, our information technology specialist, can report on our 2020 annual report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Commission's 2020 annual report reflects that despite the major challenges presented in the last year, the Commission showed great flexibility, professionalism, and resiliency, and was successful in continuing its important statutory duties in 2020 with very little interruption. I want to thank all of the staff and division chiefs who provided information for the report, and I want to give a special thanks to Rieko Ivaska, who is an information technology specialist with the Commission. She designed the look of the report and did all of that work, the work of putting it together. So I'm very thankful to have had her help. So with that, I'd like to encourage you all to take a look at the report. It's attached to the agenda and it's also available on our website.
Sorry, thank you, Ms. Nakano. Did commissioners have questions or comments on our annual report? Commissioner Cardenas.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Ms. Nakano, what kind of distribution does our annual report get? I mean, is there a courtesy mailer to all members of the legislature? Assemblymember Baker, do you recall, or Commissioner Baker, do you recall receiving one in office?
That's a tricky question, but I was an avid reader, but I don't specifically recall. We did. It's not uncommon to receive many reports from the agencies, and this would have been one because I was a kind of an election geek that I would have popped into my mind. But I have to confess, I don't remember if I read if I saw any arrive in my inbox.
I believe the plan is to release a press release on the annual report, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but that will be going out, I believe, today.
Mr.
Mr. Wairinga.
Good afternoon, Chair and Commissioners. My colleague Lindsay is correct. We are putting the finishing touches on that. Generally in the past, not only does it go out through our listserv to anyone else for everyone who signed up for anything from the FPPC. So generally that's obviously a lot of people in the regulated community, interested parties, good government groups, political officials. My office, I also reach out to the people that follow us mostly, the Capitol correspondents, some of the major newspapers, the Chronicle, the Times, the Bee, and Associated Press. So once the news release goes out, I do follow up with a lot of the media. And in past years, we have received some, last year, I believe we received some pretty good press from the Bee and the LA Times. So that's my job this afternoon.
Oh, really? I just I noticed here that in lieu of our usual photographs, someone took a screenshot of one of our Zoom hearings, and if it's going to get that kind of distribution, I just want to state for the record, you know, they say TV cameras add 10 pounds. My Zoom camera apparently adds about 40. So I just want to make sure that's understood. Thank you very much.
As a former television anchor, I can tell you that is true.
All right, Commissioner Wilson.
As a follow-up to Commissioner Cardenas's question, I want to commend the staff, especially Ms. Nakano, on all the hard work you put into producing this annual report. But it might not be a bad idea, as a follow-up to what Commissioner Cardenas said, to just take 120 copies of the report and have it distributed in the mailroom to all members of the legislature. I know most folks will look at it online, but I think to have one copy for each legislative office would be a good way to bring to the attention of the elected members of the legislature what we do on an annual basis.
Good idea, Commissioner Wilson. I like that. All right, additional questions or comments for Ms. Nakano on the 2020 annual report? Hearing and seeing none. Ms. Nakano, again, excellent job on the annual report, and congratulations to our staff as the annual report chronicles. They did an amazing job last year in a historically busy election year, even with a pandemic raging. So great job, guys. So go ahead and move then to item 17, our executive staff reports. We'll begin with the Enforcement Division, and welcome back, Ms. Brereton.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to point out that we added our 2020 numbers to the executive staff report. So you can see we were very busy. We got a lot of complaints and a lot of referrals. So, our staff really did a great job with moving as many things forward as possible, even though we were all working from home for most of the year in a busy election cycle. So other than that, my report is as submitted.
Thank you, Ms. Brereton. Questions or comments for Ms. Brereton on her executive staff report? Hearing and seeing none. We'll go ahead and move. Thank you, Ms. Brereton. We'll move to the Legal Division. Mr. Bainbridge, welcome back.
Legal Division report is as submitted.
Thank you. Questions or comments for Mr. Bainbridge? Hearing and seeing none, thank you, Mr. Bainbridge. Move to the Administration and Technology Division report. Ms. Hahn, welcome.
Good afternoon. Report is submitted.
Questions or comments for Ms. Hahn? Hearing and seeing none. Ms. Hahn, the only thing, I mentioned this earlier, but you'll be back with us in February to present the draft budget. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Excellent. We look forward to it. Thank you, Ms. Hahn. And we'll finally, last but not least, our Executive Director update, Ms. West.
Hello, thank you. So the only thing I'd like to bring to your attention is yearly we submit a report to the legislature as part of the Budget Act requirements. And we submitted that timely, and we've attached it to the agenda so you can see what information is sent to the legislature every year.
Great. Thank you, Ms. West. Ms. West, can you briefly, just for the benefit of Commissioner Baker and the public, what information in general is contained in that supplemental report to the legislature?
Sure, it's actually a workload report. So it talks about the enforcement division's workload and breaks up by case violation type and general categories, the number of cases and the pendency of the case. And then for the legal division, it does the same thing for the advice phone system and the informal advice issued through email and the demands for information. So that's their workshops and their presentations. And then we also talk about the advice letters. So the formal letters and the informal letters and the 1090 letters. So they get all the information about how many there were and then how long it took to produce that workload.
Excellent. Thank you, Ms. West. Any further questions or comments for Ms. West? Hearing and seeing none. Thank you. And last but not least, item 18, Commissioner comments and proposed future agenda items. Today, we've had numerous times reference, as I believe is true, the Commission is interested in receiving information from staff on the current treatment in the law and regulations of pass-through income. This first came about in the context of reviewing one of our stipulations. I think it was item number 6, and subsequently with respect to LLCs. To be clear, I think LLCs and source of income, we're talking about two different things. So what we would be asking is staff to come back in February with a presentation on how the law and the regs treat pass-through sources of income. So that is definitely one item that we're going to come back on. Do commissioners have additional items that they would like to see on one of our future agendas? Hearing and seeing none for today. You always have the opportunity at a future date. Don't feel like you have to do it. Commissioner Hatch.
To take a little liberty here, it's not to propose an agenda item in the future. Well, maybe it is. I was astounded to see that our 3-hour-old commissioner, Catherine Baker, was clever enough to already found a use for this Zoom where she has a stock picture of her surrounded by flags when she leaves the meeting. All of the rest of ours are black with our names, and I was impressed, and thank you for educating us that is even possible.
I don't look anything like the picture, so that's why I have it.
Right. Thank you, Commissioner Hatch, and thank you, Commissioner Baker, for bringing something new to our attention. All right. Hearing and seeing no further comments on item 18, do we have a motion to adjourn?
I move to adjourn.
Move to adjourn by Commissioner Hatch. Second. Anyone?
I'll second.
Commissioner Cardenas. Ms. Linker.
Commissioner Baker?
Aye.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Wilson?
Aye.
Chair Matich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Excellent. Thank you all very much. Welcome again, Commissioner Baker. It's been great. Okay. So we will see you all soon.
Thank you.
Take care.
Nice to see you, Dodson.